Shabbat Shalom. When I worked for Teva, which is a Jewish environmental ed organization, one of the questions that we'd pose to every group of kids with dramatic flair and a tomato held high was, where did this come from? And inevitably, the first answer was almost always the grocery store. Now, to be fair, most of the time that answer isn't wrong, unless you happen to be at IKAR's homegrown produce share Shabbat. The answer isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. It's a partial picture instead of the full story. So we'd nudge them. Did it grow in the grocery store? Oh, a farm. Great. Where do you think that farm might be? Blank stares. Well, there's snow on the ground here in Maryland in December, so not here. California? East Coasters love to guess California at any chance they have. Good. So how did it get here? And who planted the seeds and watered the beds and watered the crops and harvested the fruit and transported the yield and drove the truck cross-country and unloaded the tomatoes at that grocery store you mentioned a few minutes ago? And that's just for a tomato. Think about what you had for breakfast this morning. With every ingredient, the map of fingerprints exponentially grows. It's a simple exercise that reveals a humbling truth, one that we know but perpetually forget. We are profoundly dependent on others for nearly every aspect of our existence. Did you weave the clothing you're wearing other than you, Wendy Light? Did you bind the books we're reading from? Did you research, develop, and produce the medicine that keeps us healthy and safe? These kinds of questions are a form of spiritual medicine, an antidote to the poison of hubris and the myth of self-sufficiency. And sadly, they're countercultural. To truly acknowledge from where the gifts of life emerge is to resist the pervasive cultural stories of rugged individualism, of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and of total self-reliance. In the words of Rabbi Shai Held, real piety requires us to surrender the illusion of self-sufficiency. As human beings, we are fragile and vulnerable and therefore irreducibly dependent, both on God and on other people. This message emerges in this week's Parsha from a curious passage contrasting the land of Egypt with the land of Israel. Deuteronomy 11, 10 through 12. For the land that you are about to enter and possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. There the grain you sowed had to be watered by your foot like a vegetable garden. But the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of heaven. It is the land on which the Lord your God always keeps an eye from year's beginning to year's end. So on its most basic level, the text is contrasting the water supplies of Egypt and Israel. Egypt receives its water from the Nile, whereas Israel has no natural river, instead relying on rainfall. The water from the Nile filled irrigation channels, so when farmers needed to water their crops, they'd open a channel in the riverbank by pressing down on the mud with their feet so that water could flow into the fields. Hence, the expression from our text, in Egypt, the grain you sowed had to be watered by your foot. So here's what's puzzling. One would assume that the purpose of Moses contrasting Egypt with Israel is to highlight the superiority of the land the people are about to enter, not the land of bondage from which they escaped. But agriculturally speaking, wouldn't you prefer a land of abundant and consistently available water over a land that relies on inconsistent and often insufficient rainfall. In other words, doesn't this presentation of the availability and source of water advantage Egypt over Israel? Furthering this perplexing presentation is the Torah's own account of the agricultural vulnerability of Israel. Recall that it was a famine in the land of Israel that led both Abraham and Isaac to seek refuge in Egypt. Famine drove Jacob and his sons to Egypt, where they ultimately reunite with Joseph. But this movement to Egypt begins the story of Israelite enslavement in this land of plenty. Thus, the contrast seems to highlight the ecological superiority of Egypt, which then begs the question: what is Moses trying to teach? Water is not only a building block of life, but also of culture. How we receive water shapes our consciousness and has the potential to remind us of the ultimate truth of our existence. We are always and inevitably dependent. It's the rain that comes from above that has the ability to teach us this vital lesson. In this formulation, the readily available water of Egypt poses a spiritual risk. When sustenance is guaranteed, man begins to believe that he is the sole author of his good fortune, that he alone is in control and the outcome is always bent in his favor. Not so in a land watered by rain, where nature offers no guarantees, where man is persistently reminded that he is dependent on a force over which he has no control. And here's where the Torah is making a counterintuitive claim. You might think you prefer the conditions of Egypt, with its relative ease and freedom from want, but such a land is spiritually and ethically dangerous. It is precisely a warped sense of one's own power that breeds cruelty to others. In Egypt, a society that believed in its own mastery inevitably becomes brutal masters over other human beings. I think it's no coincidence that the water-rich landscape of Egypt is shared by another place in the Torah, the corrupt city of Sodom, which is described as, and I quote, fully watered Ke'eretz Mitzrayim, like the land of Egypt. Sodom, the city that prohibited the poor and homeless from residing within it, the city that subjected the stranger to violence and abuse, the city whose motto was, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, also knew nothing about the reliance on rainfall and in turn knew nothing about reliance on others. And so, if Egypt is a place of amnesia, a terrain of forgetting that to be human is to be dependent, Israel must be a place of memory. Israel's very ecological reality must spur the people into remembering that we are always the beneficiaries of forces unseen, that the gifts of life are marked by both the fingerprints of God and the rest of creation with whom we share this world. It's crucial to recall that Moses delivers this message to a people on the precipice of power, to a people who will, for the first time in their narrative, shape the contours of a burgeoning society. Those without power, whether it's the slaves of Egypt or the disenfranchised of today, rarely forget how dependent their lives are. It's those with power who run the risk of believing the myth of self-sufficiency, which is the first step in rendering the people around you as invisible or worse, worthless. And when power collides with the illusion of self-reliance, those with less are inevitably taken advantage of. So Moses is warning the people. The ecology of Egypt can lead to the ethics of Egypt. Your task is to create the anti-Egypt. Your task is to create the society that understands its dependence on one another and God, and by extension, internalizes and codifies the responsibility to look out for each other. The rain, Moses is saying, will be a teacher of this crucial lesson. I want to add one more piece to this story, based on the insightful writing of Dr. Dvorah Steinmetz in her new book, Why Rain Comes from Above. Dr. Steinmetz connects the passage from Deuteronomy with a beautiful midrash in Breshit Rabbah that seeks to explain what God is trying to teach the people by sending water in the form of rain. The midrash reads, God decided that the land would only drink from above on account of strong men, so that the high might drink like the low, and so that all would direct their eyes upward. So let's break it down. On account of strong men. While the water from a river can be siphoned off by those who live upstream, leaving little or no water for people who are poorly situated, rain cannot be controlled by the powerful. Everyone deserves their fair share of blessing. So that the high might drink like the low. Unlike in a landscape of rivers, geography does not predetermine social status. Rain falls equally on the mountains and in the valleys for the rich and the poor alike, meaning water is equally available to everyone. Dr. Steinmetz writes, in this midrash, rain itself is a vehicle for the doing of good. It comes in a way that prevents people from using their power to take advantage of others, and it comes in a way that gives everyone an equal share. Rain is designed to create a consciousness of how God wants divine blessing to be shared. Rain is our teacher. Look up, and you'll remember how dependent and vulnerable we truly are. And when you look up, you in turn remember to look around, to see all the people we are accountable to and dependent on, to see the bonds that connect us all. Shabbat Shalom.